Hi again, everybody. It's Grandmama again. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. First Autos. Hello. Tonight we're starting another month, our second month of reading from the Hometown Scrapbook. When we started this program, we expected a pretty good hearing because, after all, it's about our hometown, which is about as close to home as we can get with a personalized program. Now we find that not only do we have a good share of regular listeners, but we have a lot of friends whose stories and recollections fit right into the pattern of our program. Hardly a program is broadcast without some phone calls with helpful material from the listeners. Some calls in with additional anecdotes about the characters we've mentioned, some correct us on a date or a place, and some give us leads on new stories. Such a friend is Joe Wilt, longtime Hoquiam resident, who provided much of the material for the yarn about Christopherson's airplane flight and some of the material that makes up tonight's story. Another is Jim Fuller, Aberdeen city treasurer, whose great store of harbor stories seems never to run out, and who knows a little about most everyone who has lived here since the 20th century began. Mrs. William Irvine and Mrs. Mabel McKinley Hopkins have over the years strung together many of my materials, and there are others here that we will mention as the stories they have uncovered come up in this scrapbook. Sometimes I run into an old-timer who has a different version of a story than the one that I have found. After my story about Clam Joe and Joe Clam, one of them said, "Why, there's never been such a character here." So I referred him to the old-timer who used to watch those two fishermen peddle their fishing wares on Heron Street. Sure, there were such characters, and probably a lot more that the doubting old-timer didn't recall. A powerful lot of folks lived on Grays Harbor at one time or another, but when an old-timer has a version of a story that is different than ours, I hope he won't dissent to call us or write us, but better still, drop in for a chat. We can only reach back a scant 40 years for personal recollections, and the first of those are a little vague. So for accuracy and authenticity, we're dependent on you who were there to know what happened, and you know who the characters are, and tell us about them. We have lots of sources to check with, old city directories, old newspaper findings, and a few ancient publications like the Illustrated Monthly Northwest magazine, which has what is probably the first comprehensive biography of Grays Harbor. Sometimes we check with the abstract office where the records go back to the beginning of Chehalis County and even before. So if you have an incident out of Grays Harbor's past that you think needs to be included in our scrapbook, pass it along. Or if it's a different wrinkle on something we have, we need to know that too. Well, that's that. And now tonight's yarn. But before we get into that, let's have a few from Dick Crombie and our sponsors. Now, the average American jumps into his car and roars off down the road without giving much thought to the day when he had a choice of transportation between a snorting, cinder-sooting railroad, a throbbing steam-driven ship, a bicycle, or an old gray mare. But Grays Harbor, even for its relative youth, saw a lot of history before the gasoline buggy came roaring over the horizon to change our way of life. And the coming of that wonder of the world was important enough to make quite a yarn in our scrapbook. You may recall that we were making quite a noise about the horseless carriage when the 20th century came in. But at that time, the largest cities in the East could boast a handful of the new machines. So there was no use looking for a 1900 Ford or Cadillac in our hometown history that far back. But the talk of the new machineries filtered down this way, and it put ideas into the heads of some of the mechanical geniuses, particularly a pair of Hoquiam men who thought that it wasn't a bad idea. I regret that I don't have the Smith and Kuhn names of those two pioneers, or perhaps those were the names of the pioneers of harbor transportation. Most of my information came from an ancient editorial commenting on the machine, and it was vague as to the owners. It was written principally to show how foolish men could be, but it contained a lot of information on the pair who lived before their time. Anyhow, it appears that this pair of adventurers decided that a horseless carriage was the answer to transportation between Hoquiam and Aberdeen. The new plank road linking the two cities had just been opened, and there was smooth sailing for surreys, drays, and hacks. Why not for an automobile? They drew plans for their machine. They went about assembling the parts, making a few, adapting others, and converting some others into items they needed for new use. And what they produced caused mouths to drop open and the citizens to stand amazed. It was a steam-driven, trackless locomotive with a passenger car and everything. It had a smokestack, a spark arrestor, and a tender on behind for wood and coal, and space enough for an engineer and a conductor. Early in 1901, it made a test run and was pronounced ready to begin commercial operation. It promptly took off in a sprint for Aberdeen, snorting and puffing along. It caused as much excitement in Aberdeen as it had in Hoquiam, and children ran beside it in the streets, where it could make up to 15 miles an hour. For 10 days it did a thriving business hauling passengers between the two cities. Then on the 11th day, with a full load of passengers, it lurched off the plank road not far from the Ninemeyer and Morgan slaughterhouse, which would be just on the Aberdeen side of Myrtle Street, and ended up in a slough. One passenger was seriously injured, and the editorial pointed out the dangers of playing with fire. No, the harbor was not yet ready for the age of speed, and for several years it went right on cracking the whip across the laboring flanks of Old Dublin, while the outside world discovered the fragrance of gasoline fumes and donned the linen dusters and goggles to get behind the wheel. But it finally came, and it was almost as everyone expected. The Aborigines in darkest Africa and Australia when they saw it. Now just who bought the first automobile to the harbor, I can't determine. Frank Becker, who years later erected the harbor's tallest building, had one of the early cars. On its first run down Heron Street, its driver got it started and couldn't stop it until it ran out of gas. He drove it around in circles at the corner of Heron and F Street while the curious onlookers came out of O'Hare's and Pioneer Saloon to watch the miraculous machine flick up the sawdust and silver in the planking. In any event, George Emerson, the patriarch of Hoquiam, bought the first horseless carriage to that city, and its history is pretty well preserved. The exact model I can't determine, but I'm sure that Frank Lamb, son-in-law of the pioneer motorist, could recall the year it was rushed off of the production line and ended up in Hoquiam. It was a Cadillac, 1 cylinder, 10 horsepower, and you entered its spacious 4-passenger touring area up a flight of stairs at the rear. It was a majestic sight to see the founder of Hoquiam driving to the office in the snorting machine. But as new models were produced, he saw one he wanted, and in 1908 traded the Cadillac for a Maxwell. It was a lighter car, had 2 cylinders, and was considered quite an improvement on the first, and his old machine became the harbor's first used car. Automobile dealers sometimes think they have a problem with used cars today, but there was that was nothing compared to that of the garage man, the first garage man in Hoquiam, who took that Cadillac in trade. He had first to rebuild it, then find somebody adventurous who would buy the thing. Well, in the course of looking, he lit on Joe Wilt, whose principal interest in the machinery lay in his profession. He was a machinist. A demonstration of the car was arranged, and Joe and his wife and the entire family were taken on a ride through Hoquiam. But the ride didn't sell the car. So to clinch the deal, the owner invited the Wilts to take a trip with him to Montesano in the car that following Sunday. They left at 8 a.m. in the morning, and the car fairly purred along until they passed through Aberdeen. Then they had their first flat tire. But that didn't stop them. The dealer had a patching set, and the tire was yanked off, patched, and pumped up. They were on their way again. At Junction City, the old road to Montesano went through Junction City and over the flats. At Junction City, they had a second blowout. This was harder to fix. So they took off the tire and drove on the rim. The road had just been graded, so it was reasonably smooth sailing. They made Montesano by noon. While the passengers lunched at the hotel, the used car salesman hustled about the town looking for a tire to cover the wheel. He found one. Even in that long ago time, ingenuity and persistence were rewarded. He found a tire. Of course, it didn't fit. It was for a motorcycle, but it was rubber, and he tied it on with ropes. This outfitted the voyagers, and they started for home. About halfway, they met the first traffic of the trip. It was a horse and a buggy driven by a farmer's wife, and at 1,000 yards it became apparent that this was the first automobile the horse had ever encountered. It snorted, reared its hind legs, lunged, and came down astride the shafts. By this time, Joe Wilt was at the wheel of the Cadillac, and as a gentleman did in those days of primitive motoring, he pulled off the road to stop and help the horse pass the car. It was a mistake. The car shuddered and settled in. The axles went in the soft loam. The horse got past all right, but it was 2 hours later before the car was back on the road again. Meanwhile, it had thrown both of its rear tires trying to dig itself out. But the tires were put back on, the family loaded aboard, and like all good things, the happy trip to Montesano came to an end late that evening. But the automobile, which was being demonstrated to the potential customer, had been demonstrated right out of existence. It limped into the garage and expired. It was not only never sold, it never ran again. And Joe Wilt wasn't sure that automobiles were here to stay. He waited until 1912 to buy a Model T. But that was only the first car in Hoquiam. Others came, but before we get to that, here's a word from our sponsor and Dick Crombie. But George Emerson, when he bought his Maxwell, had plenty of motoring company. Other cars were now sputtering around the streets of Hoquiam and Aberdeen, and there were about a half a dozen. Frank Lamb had a brand new steamer that cut quite a figure, except when it tried to cross a railroad track at an angle. The car's wheels spread was just narrow enough to fit between the rails, and more than once it blocked the tracks by slipping between the rails and refusing to get out without help. Yes, those were great days when all the motorist needed to make repairs to his car was a wad of chewing gum and some hairpins. When you had been for a real drive, if you got around the block before the engine melted or ran out through the exhaust pipe, or all 4 tires blew out at once. They made life more interesting for Grays Harbor by the narrow plank roads and winding earth lanes, or just no roads at all. It's been nearly half a century since that smoke-belching monster rode over the plank road between Aberdeen and Hoquiam, and that half-century has written the modern history of our harbor and the automobile. Impractical though it may have seemed to Joe Wilt after his 10-hour round trip to Montesano, it plays an important part in our history, important enough to warrant a page in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.